Hey, we're live.
We are live, calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
I am here, Chris. I'm here every week.
You just never leave that seat.
I really don't. I really pretty much don't. That is true. During waking hours, this is where I am. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour, whether you're watching us live or watching us after the fact. And we're going to wait a moment for people to join us and get started.
Well, before we get started, though,
Okay.
Marcus is here, and I want to thank Marcus. I got this really awesome bottle stopper that Marcus made for me.
Okay.
It's all,
Wow.
101st themed. My only problem, of course, is that I very rarely leave a bottle half full. But I will try, Marcus, to not finish a whole bottle so that I can use your stopper.
All right. So you've gotten a gift there, and the stopper comes at a apropos time because, Chris, this is our 1 year anniversary show.
Oh, hard to believe, huh?
It is our 52nd show. It is the last episode of season 1. Could be a cliffhanger. I don't know what's going to happen.
So for season 2, which will take us from
There's a
lockdown
new cast.
4
There's a
through
new cast
lockdown-
for season 2. It's going to be much better.
Okay.
I want to remind everybody we're talking about history every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages, and every show is archived on the History Happy Hour webpage, which is on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours website. Okay,
Very well
I
put.
said that all. And thank you, everybody, for checking in. Looks like we have a bunch of people here. I see Kathy and Neil and Valerie and John and Doug McCord is wishing us happy
Hey, Bernard.
anniversary. And we've got John. And, of course, Marcus was here first. I mean, we don't want to
Yes.
forget that Marcus
We
was here.
can't start if Marcus is first.
We can't start if Marcus is not here. And Lynn and Stephen and Ted and many other folks here. But, Chris, I think we certainly have reached a critical mass, don't you,
I think so.
that we can get started?
Agreed.
Can I have the drum roll?
The bar is open.
The bar is open, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, and writer Menachem Kaiser, who grew up in Toronto but lives in Brooklyn, New York. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York, and elsewhere, and he is the author of a very interesting book that we're going to talk about today, which is Plunder, Family, Property, and Nazi Treasure. And it's a very unusual book because it's some personal history, a personal journey, a memoir. It's a rumination on history. It's got a legal battle. It's got secret Nazi tunnels and a lot more.
UFOs.
It does have UFOs. So it goes to a lot of interesting places. Welcome, Menachem, to History Happy Hour.
It's so fun to be here.
How do you know?
I'm already sitting. I'm already
You're
having
just
a beer.
hoping. You're just hoping it's
If
going
I
to
can
be
have an
very
excuse to drink in the day, I'll take
What are
it.
you drinking
There
today?
we go.
I stole it from someone. It's Maine Beer Company from Freeport, Maine. Some pale ale.
nice.
I'm not usually a beer drinker, but
But on this
there
occasion,
was ever an occasion.
But History
Exactly.
Happy Hour would be the time.
Yeah.
And then I'm drinking an Abbé Lef. How about you, Chris?
I've got a shoof in honor of all those nights at the bar in Bastogne.
Fair enough. I could have gone down the street to Warehouse Liquors. Warehouse Liquors sponsors that. No, unfortunately.
But you didn't, did
and
you?
gotten a Polish beer, but I didn't. That would have been good. Okay, enough of the silliness. We should start. Menachem, one of the things that our audience has in common with you, with Chris, with me, one of the things we all have and most of us have in common is that these folks have traveled to Europe to connect with World War II history, and sometimes with family history, through specific places. It's a battlefield, a building, and that's kind of how your book starts as well, connecting with family history through a place, an apartment building in this place. So
Sure.
tell us a little bit, just to kind of get us all started before we start diving into the secret tunnels, tell us a little bit about how this story begins.
Sure. In 2010, I did a Fulbright fellowship in Lithuania. And then I did not go for any sort of family history reasons. I had other research to do. I ended up researching the Vilna Ghetto quite a bit. But this is a long and fun story, but the short version is I ended up meeting the German supergroup, the Scorpions. And their road manager was this Hasidic Jew from Brooklyn, and he invited me to come to Krakow for Rosh Hashanah. And so I went, again, not really for any family reasons, just for a good time. But once I was there, I felt a sort of like sentimental obligation, you might say, to visit my grandfather's hometown. I never knew my grandfather. He died well before I was born. He was a Holocaust survivor, but I never knew his history, and I never even really felt all that burdened by it. It was sort of like a tragic part of the story, but one that I wasn't familiar with at all. I visited the building. That was in 2011. Took pictures, had like a meaningful moment, and then told myself I would never go back. But over the next few years, I ended up spending a lot of time in Poland. I really fell in love with the country, and my father kept mentioning that we had these documents that sort of detailed my grandfather's decades-long attempt to recover this property. And then it was never all that pressing, but eventually he faxed me the documents. And I initiated a legal claim to recover the building in 2015. So that was my sort of entry into that part of the world and this book.
So the part that I missed, because I don't think it was in your book, is the part about the scorpions. That part's not there, is it?
It's not. It got cut. It was like too weird. Even in a book with Nazi UFOs.
There's something that's too weird?
Too weird. I took 2 members of the Scorpions to karaoke in Vilnius and begged them to sing Winds of Change, but they refused. To their credit.
The things you find out on History Happy Hour.
Yeah.
So, Menachem, one of the things I'm curious about, and this might come in part from living in London, but I travel a lot to Poland, and one of the narratives of Polish history is Poland, the victims, Poland, the guys that got run over by the Nazis. Lots of Poles escape to the West and fight valiantly, and then they get kind of done in by Churchill at the end of the war. Mm-hmm. But then there's also the version of Poland that you kind of talk about in the book of Poland the enemy, or Poland is a place that's, you have some adversarial feelings about. So, which one is the right Poland, and how do you view it now after having written the book? I mean, where do these two views of Poland kind of come together?
Sure. Both my grandparents were Polish, but the idea that my father was Polish was not one that it wasn't an idea I was familiar with. My father would never identify as Polish, despite being the son of 2 Polish immigrants. So I grew up with what I would call like a Jewish narrative, and so there's obvious trauma and victimhood, and then there was definitely a sense of betrayal. I think they grew up in this country, and they understood who the aggressors were, but they said this country it felt like a betrayal to them. And I talk about it in my book, and it's a narrative I grew up with, but it's one that I don't feel really totally comfortable articulating. Because it was never really articulated to me firsthand. And so it's something that, it was just like a familiar but unarticulated narrative of Poland as a country. And so I spent about 10 years, for about 10 years I went 2 or 3 months a year to Poland. So I spent quite a bit of time there. And I had just everything I found was everyone was incredibly supportive and curious and interested and invested. And I found a lot of institutional support, a lot of local artists and scholars, doctoral students, just a tremendous sort of grassroots interest in my history, my narrative. But yeah, there's totally a sort of grappling with this other narrative, and they don't often fit together. I do think they coexist, and I think it's sort of up to historians and writers to sort of squeeze these two things to sort of complexify the history. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you see, and look, as an American, I grew up in Canada, spent most my adult life in the U.S. It's something that takes a lot of getting used to, and sort of how charged history can be, how political an issue World War II narrative is. Yeah. And so Poland, and I think it very justifiably feels like their narrative has been suppressed. It's happened it happened in Germany in the 70s and 80s, and in the historic right. It happened in a lot of the other Eastern European countries. I think Poland is pretty far along. I think the new government has thrown a wrench in some of the progress that's been made. But yeah, to your question, Chris, like, I don't know if obviously neither one is right. The question is sort of, can we complexify and appreciate dueling narratives, if you will?
Yeah,
Well,
I know.
go ahead,
I'm sorry.
Chris.
No, I was just going to follow up on that because I know, I have a lot of friends in Poland because back when I could travel, would go there a couple times a year. And I remember talking to one Polish history graduate student, and we were there at Auschwitz with one of my groups, and they were one of those large groups of Israeli school students, and they'd spent, whatever, the 2 weeks traveling around Poland. And all they saw were Holocaust sites and ghettos and concentration camps. And my friend, who totally was involved in the history and teaching the history, was like, they don't talk to any Poles, and they don't talk to me, and they don't. So, they seem to be stuck.
Right.
He was getting very frustrated by
I,
that.
I totally understand that. I would say most of my peers who've visited Poland have done a lot within a group like that. And so the most popular one is March of the Living. And so they'll go to Poland for a week or 2 weeks, and they'll just go to sites of death. And again, I think these sites are important to visit. I think they're important memorials. I think they're important for our understanding and appreciation of the gravity of the war. But I do think you're right. I think it sort of ignores Poland as a country, and just treats it as like a gigantic graveyard. And it just sort of ignores like that necessary grappling that's going to make it like a richer and more interesting and more complex history.
Yeah.
I'll just take us to a different place here.
Sorry about that.
Well, because I'm going to follow the theme of this book, which is, so we get 50 pages in. It doesn't take very long before you take us to a very mysterious Nazi tunnel complex. I mean, I would say I didn't see this coming, except it's actually mentioned on the back of the book. I wouldn't have seen it coming if it hadn't been mentioned on the back of the book. And some of this is, and we have some pictures of it that we can show also, some of this is right out of a James Bond novel. How did you end up there? It's called Project Riesa, I think, if I'm saying it correctly. Riesa. What is it? What's going on there? And how did you end up there? How did it end up in your story?
Sure. So Project Riesa was a series of 7 underground complexes built by the Nazis using mostly Jewish slave labor in the last about year and a half, 2 years of the war. And so all of them are unfinished. Some of them are closer to completion than others. The ones that are, so this one is the smallest one. It's called Sobon, and this one is relatively small, just like one tunnel. Now, some of the larger ones closer to completion are right. This one is Osufka. We're talking, these are enormous, sort of like mind-bogglingly huge. We're talking square kilometers, 20-meter high ceilings. And some of it has reinforced concrete, and like in those photos, you'll see just how sinister it looks. Now, what makes
we should say,
sorry?
I should jump in and say that these fine photos were taken by Jason Francisco, who we want to credit, and you better be watching. And you better be watching and acknowledge that credit, or they'll be held to pay.
We'll take away the credit.
We'll take away the credit. Absolutely.
And so these 7 tunnels, what makes them like truly remarkable in a sense, beyond like just the engineering, is that we do not have any primary documentation, virtually no primary documentation that we found within any of the German records. And so there is, again, no records that definitively tell us what they were going to be used for. Now, historically, we have a pretty good idea because we know what the Nazis tended to do with their undergrounds. So they would have been like weapons depots or bunkers, or maybe alternative headquarters in case of an air raid. And this is in Silesia in southwest Poland, right by like a city called Wałbrzych, but it was Germany before the war. And so, but because there is no primary documentation, a huge amount of mystery has like built up around these tunnels, especially among a group of what gets referred to in the press as "quote unquote" treasure hunters, which is a pretty significant subculture in that part of the country. Now, the way I got there was in 2015. 2 of these so-called treasure hunters made a press conference and announced to the world that they had discovered the so-called Golden Train, which is an ostensibly legendary train full of looted Nazi gold that was taken from Wrocław, was, according to legend, en route to Berlin, was diverted and hidden inside of a mountain. And so, for really interesting reasons that we could get into, the world decided to take these claims extremely seriously. And so you had like the New Yorker, Time Magazine, New York Times, BBC, Fox News, Sky, all these sort of major international news organizations descended onto this village called Wabrzeg. And, some of the headlines from that time were kind of really wild. In Britain especially, some of the tabloids were like, they found a Nazi gold train, instead of saying, two guys claim to have found a golden train. And so it was just like, it sort of, they still refer to it, they call it golden train fever. It sort of is like a watershed moment in the subculture. But I heard about that, I read like, I think it was the New Yorker piece, and it sort of broke my brain. I was like, well, who are these guys? What's going on? I had spent a lot of time in Poland. I never heard of any of this stuff. And at the time I was in graduate school working on fiction, and I thought this would probably be a pretty compelling setting for a story. So I reached out to a guide, this woman named Joanna Lamparska, who is like the cited authority in pretty much every single one of these articles. And she said yes, and we went for 2 days, and she took me to some of the tunnels and introduced me to some of these treasure hunters.
So Menachem, I just want to be, just really quickly, has anybody actually found treasure? I mean, they find lots of rusty bits of metal, right?
Yeah.
But has anybody actually found any, like...
Yeah, but rusty bits of metal hunters doesn't really...
I understand. No, I was just curious.
The answer is yes, but let me first sort of broaden the category. Okay. So we call them treasure hunters, just like that's how it gets sort of used in English, like the term that gets bandied about. They're not... Most of them are not looking for treasure. Most of them are sort of, I would say, what they call mystery, which is looking for answers. And so I would call them extremely hands-on historians. Okay. And so they're interested in like spaces that are kind of mysterious and we don't know everything yet. That said, there's a subset of this group who are total profiteers, and they are digging up things and they're selling World War I and World War II artifacts. That is a small minority, as I understand it. Okay, so there's those guys. Putting those guys aside, you have sort of the bulk of them are these hobbyists. Now, some of them are very sophisticated, with LiDAR and georadar and magnetometers and using very sophisticated GPS equipment and diggers. But a lot of them are just guys with metal detectors. You even have sometimes sponsored expeditions. Now, they find a huge amount of stuff. And so I've personally been in two what I would call private museums of guys who have built a whole room or sometimes even a house full of their treasure. So you have a lot of Nazi stuff, a lot of communist stuff, World War I stuff, anything from mortars to glass eyes to currency. In terms of stuff that's very valuable, I've seen pictures. So I haven't seen it in person. I saw a photo of a gold nugget, for sure. But I will say, besides you have the treasure hunters who are going out and looking for these things, but you have a very long history of people finding things. Mm-hmm. And so you had that part of the region was full of German nobility. Yeah. And so when the war came, there was a lot of people fleeing, a lot of people hid their stuff. Yeah. And so you have for years, and not even that long ago, people would build a new foundation for the house and turn up sometimes extremely valuable things. Like a very famous one in the 90s, I think it was, they found a crown that got dated to the 16th century to the Queen of Bohemia, I believe it was. Wow. Just a priceless artifact. So it absolutely does happen, but in any of these sort of cases, the legends are going to far outstrip the reality.
Yeah. Well, I want to get back to some of the quote unquote treasure hunters and some of the attitudes about Nazi Germany that they kind of represent or stand in for. But it might be, I think if I was watching in the audience right now, I'd say, well, wait a minute. He started out talking about his grandfather in an apartment building and going to Poland, and now he's in these tunnels, which had nothing to do with the rock band, and so obviously those things can't be connected, and yet, you probably were surprised as anybody to discover a very close connection.
Yep. So basically, I'll tell this story quickly. So what happened was after they showed me some of these tunnels, and I had what surely was maybe the strangest 2 days of my life. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't even. It's not even close. And but it was quite. And a lot of it didn't even make it to the book. I just like they showed me like an 800-year-old brewery. Like I was just and like a crypt that's like 1,000 years old and is still in use. I mean, just like the things you could find in that part of the world.
Volume 2.
We met like a self declared count who lived in a castle without running water. I mean, just like the stuff it just kept coming. But the end of this whole time, we had met these two treasure hunters, these guys Andrzej and Janek, and we were just sitting around having a beer, just sort of kicking back, and we were asking all these sort of like fun questions like what's going on, what have you guys find, what's your job, just sort of very gentle questioning, really just kibitzing. And then my friend who was with me, she asked like a question that I wouldn't have had the balls to ask, which was like, what do you guys do about the fact that all these Jews and other slave laborers died while digging these tunnels? Like, how does that sort of affect your sense of self and your mission? And like, you have they're very macho, full of bravado, and they're like, what about that these are sites of mass death? And they got like very animated and started speaking very rapidly. And I don't speak Polish, so I couldn't understand what they were saying. And let me just quickly add, they didn't know my name. They knew my first name, they didn't know my last name. And so they started talking very rapidly in Polish, and I was just sort of waiting for it to be translated. But I kept hearing in the conversation, Kaiser, which is my last name, which they did not know, so I didn't know who they were referring to. And so eventually, it kept coming, and I kept confirming that they were in fact saying Kaiser, until I eventually stopped them and I said, "Who are you talking about?" And they said, "Oh, Abraham Kaiser." I hadn't heard of who that guy was, and they sort of they gave me the background. So he was a slave laborer. He was a prisoner in 8 of these camps, and he had kept a secret diary while working on these tunnels. And after he survived, and after the war, which is another sort of very crazy and moving story, he borrowed a bicycle from the German woman who saved him, and went and collected all these scraps that he had hidden in the camps, brought them to an editor, and they were published in Poland in the early 60s. It's called Zarzutami Śmierci, which is like Behind the Wires of Death. And now this book, this memoir, because of that total lack of primary documentation, has become a sort of sacred text among this community. One that is just like read. I would meet guys who've read it 40 times, or guys who would follow the pilgrimage. It's just an incredibly valuable and important text within this community. And what I discovered was, because of the research I had done in trying to reclaim the building, I had built out a family tree, and discovered that this Abraham Kaiser was my grandfather's closest surviving relative, was his first cousin, which came as
Wow.
just like a huge shock. In my family, we grew up, and my father had grown up thinking that no cousins, no relatives had survived. His siblings, his parents, his aunts, his uncles, of what we always had thought was a very large family. So it just very suddenly the family went from extinct to not extinct. It was a real shift in our own sense of family history. So this is how these two narratives sort of collapsed into each other.
That must have made you a big hit with the treasure hunters.
Yeah, I became kind of a celebrity among them. They were just so excited to have Abraham Kaiser's kin. Now they sort of went with the story that I was his grandson, and eventually, I stopped correcting them. But to them, it was like a very big honor to have Abraham Kaiser's, quote unquote grandson with them and interested. And they do really love being written about. And so they love it, in my experience at least. And so the fact that I was a writer on top of that made it even sweeter.
So, Menachem, how do you think they dealt though with that sort of dichotomy of we're really interested in these structures and the history and finding rusty bits of metal in the ground, but there's this whole Holocaust narrative that's going on at the same time, and
Yeah.
how did they deal with that, or did they?
I'm reluctant always to characterize the community
Sure, yeah.
as a community, just because there's a lot of them and they're coming from very different places. And also, let me sort of emphasize, I don't speak Polish. So my communication with most of them was always going to be mediated. So I'm always going to start with that my insight is going to be limited.
Yeah.
That said, to the ones I spoke to, and we had some of them, we had like very intense conversations about it. No one was ever disrespectful.
Right. Yeah,
And
yeah.
look, and I would meet, I met two of them whose grandfathers were Jewish, actually, and who were in some of these camps. Now, they themselves didn't identify as Jewish, but they absolutely identified with their grandfather's legacy,
Sure.
and they started the part of their historical legacy. So yeah, they none of them are unaware, and I never met anyone who sort of suppressed that information. But what are they doing there? Are they sort of there to memorialize Holocaust atrocity? No. But sort of the lesson that they taught me is that a motivated love can still be love. The respect, even if it's not necessarily coming from the right place, is something. And also add, these are sites, a lot of these sites, which are historically significant sites, whether or not they're doing historically significant activities, these are way off the historical map. This is not the Warsaw Ghetto. This is not Auschwitz. This is not a concentration camp. There are no museums sort of memorializing these places. These are places that would be lost, that are, if no one sort of cared about them, within a few years or a few decades, they would be wiped off. And in fact, one treasure hunter, this guy, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he had spent a few years researching and interviewing locals, and he discovered a concentration camp that was just not on the historical record. And so I think just absolutely deserve credit for sort of this sense of guardianship
Yeah.
that no one else is doing.
Yeah, and I didn't. As I was reading the book, I didn't think that they were kind of downplaying the atrocity or not
Yeah.
acknowledging it. But it's something that I've been curious about, because even when I do tours, say of Normandy,
Yeah.
the guests get so interested in the history of what happened there, or they're so into what this German tank did. You have to kind of stop yourself sometimes and say, well, yeah, but this was all going on in the backdrop of something else, and
Yeah.
I was just curious.
I'll say this. I mentioned in the book very briefly, but one of those seven. So some of these tunnels are open to the public, and some are not. And so most of the ones that are open to the public are sort of managed by the state, and those tend to be pretty sober and responsible. And so they have very responsible and educated guides. There's no sort of outlandish displays. It's hopefully the guests, I don't know to what extent, but hopefully they're getting some sense of the gravity of the sites. Now, one of them is managed privately. I don't know how that happened, but he got a 30-year lease, and he operates it like a theme park. Yeah. And so that one is more discomforting. And so when I was there, he was putting the finishing touches on the latest attraction, which is a replica gold train, which was about the size of the train in a zoo. And so you'd go on the train, and there'd be a conductor, and you'd get this train tour of the tunnel, and you'd pass mannequins in pajamas who are the Jews, and then mannequins in Nazi uniforms who are overseeing. And so it's oh, that's bad. And in fact, I actually think I saw the train. But I don't think it actually ended up opening. I think even within this community, people were a little too far. But he didn't understand this guy named Krzysztof. He didn't understand the problem. He thought he was educating people, and you're okay, it's just different kind of sensitivity.
Yeah.
Well, one of the themes in your book that resonated with me, and we're really kind of on this subject right now, is what you refer to as kind of a cultural obsession with the Nazis. And I think Chris hinted at it as well. And so obviously the real historical reality of the Nazis is a big thing and absolutely terrible, and you have the Holocaust, but then you have this cultural obsession with the Nazis and their cool tanks, or their ingenious rockets, or their secret tunnels, or for some people who kind of go even further, it's maybe they invented time travel, and maybe they did this and that, and there's people who believe this stuff, and it all seems kind of strangely disconnected from, and maybe even trivializing, the reality of the Holocaust. And I thought you made that point. I thought it was a very powerful point.
Yeah. In my book specifically, I dealt with sort of the more outlandish conspiracy theories that I sort of kept encountering. And like you said, there was time travel, there was flying saucers, there were sort of Nazi alien alliances. And like most of the guys I met, weren't proponents of some of these wilder beliefs, but like a lot was there, and sort of the underlying belief structure that I sort of kept running up against. And and like at first, I didn't understand necessarily the danger of these beliefs because they seem so silly. You sort of laugh them off. But, eventually as I went deeper and deeper in, I think, like you said, Rick, it's sort of, you sort of start seeing the perversity and sort of the danger of this sort of very sneaky kind of historical revisionism. And that, like, if the moral narrative of the war is going to become about Nazi time travel, you're sort of ignoring quite a bit and trivializing what I would consider a much more pressing moral narrative of the war. But like you said, I do think it goes even beyond just conspiracy theories. I think there's like this weird cultural obsession with the Nazis. And you see it in the movies. You see it like when you watch the History Channel. It's just kind of outrageous. And like it doesn't seem, and it could be very well intentioned because they do represent this sort of like absolute zero of evil. And it's just like, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to get around. We're like endlessly curious about it. But yeah, it's a fine line until it slips.
Yeah, you have a passage that I want to quote. Always beware of interviewers who start reading your book back to you. But you say, even within more mainstream circles, the Nazis are talked about as if they were supernaturally evil, not quite of this world, something irrational and incomprehensible, something that should have been impossible if the laws of nature held. And although most of us have not fully surrendered our skepticism, most of us are not ready to believe that the Nazis had a time machine, we've surrendered quite a bit. And it's the idea that even those of us who aren't, quite buying the Nazi alien alliance, although really I do want to do a little more investigating because I think, might be onto something there. That by kind of starting down that road, we invest them with a power or a cultural power that's kind of scary.
Yeah, there's like the one thing that kept coming out to me, we have this sort of fetishization that gets really sneaky, and fetishization could sort of, it's not, but it could sort of operate very similarly to unintentional valorization. And we sort of like, who are the protagonists of this story? And sort of like when we start like imbuing so much like cultural material and it's like weight on the Nazis and they're like evil them, yeah, things get really screwy when you start like, how are we supposed to sort of understand the war? And it's like, it's such a vast subject that the framing becomes very significant, especially when we're like talking to people who don't know that much. And so like, if it's a method of education, and like if people's only entry into World War II is about Nazi super weapons, I don't think that's like sort of the correct message.
Yeah.
Despite them having some super weapons.
Right. I mean, there's some reality there.
Yeah,
but yeah.
And it's a super interesting subject, but like it should be framed properly.
So Mac, one of the things that I'm also very curious about, because I have spent a lot of time in Poland and I enjoy it very much and I know a lot of Polish people. What do you think, is there anything in Poland or the history of Poland that draws these people to become hunters or treasure hunters? I mean, because there are people interested in the war all over the world, and I meet people really interested in World War II history in France and Holland and Belgium, and they sometimes go and look at battlefields and take a few pictures, but their magazine is After the Battle, which is a history magazine, whereas the Hunters magazine is not. So does it say anything about Poland, do you think?
That's a good question. And again, here's me sort of re-emphasizing my ignorance. I do think it's a very special country for a lot of reasons. And one is sort of, it just has occupied such a central place in a lot of this history. And it's just the site also. It's like, as opposed to, I'm trying to think of like another, it's just the devastation that was like wreaked on that country, on that land, is just like enormous. And it doesn't, even like when you go to Germany, for example, you're not going to encounter this kind of infrastructure, like this
Right.
sort of Nazi infrastructure that you will in Poland. But I do think because the history is so complicated, and because you have so much trauma and displacement, and I don't know if it would be matched in any other of these countries, I just, the way I started understanding it, and again, my limited sense, was that like it left a lot of holes. There was like a tremendous amount of voids in terms of knowledge, in terms of space, and in terms of like sort of these dueling narratives that don't really agree on the historical meaning of an event or a space or a person. And so I think like it sort of attracts like an endless curiosity. And look, it's in a lot of ways, Poland as a modern day country is not that old. And so like they had this like very devastating, communist era. And so you're saying it emerges from that only in the 90s, and that's only then can a real reckoning happen. And so, yeah, I just like, it's still in its infancy in a way of sort of like coming to terms with what happened and sort of like, the Poland complicity, Poland victimhood. These are difficult, very difficult subjects. Yeah.
So we do have some questions and about the tunnels. And
sure.
people are fascinated by the tunnels, and I'm sure you run into that a lot. And we kind of mentioned this, but just to maybe go back to it a little bit, Chuck asked what your theory is about the actual purpose of these tunnels, which and someone else also asked about do we think they were just made with axe and pickaxe and hammers? Can you really make tunnels like that with that? Do you? I know there's not much documentation. They're probably underground factories or bunkers, as you've said. But what do we know? Do we know anything about how many people made them, or anything at all that we know?
Yeah, we have rough ideas. So, if I'm remembering correctly, I think we have a number of like about 14,000 Jews died digging these tunnels. And so you're saying the slave labor was vast, and it was brutal work. So people were getting cycled in and out very, very often. It was also highly secretive work. So they were sort of rotating prisoners from camp to camp. There was heavy machinery. They were building designated train tracks. There was a whole lot of German companies were involved in the sort of construction. There was dynamite. But there was also a lot of just very difficult manual labor. In terms of my theory, my theory is going to skew to the responsible.
You're not going with
but I will.
the time
I'll tell
travel
you.
chamber?
I'll tell you my favorite theory.
Okay.
And again, there's, as far as I know, no evidence to support it, but it is my
Those are
favorite
the best
theory.
kinds of theories.
Yeah, it's that this project was done by Nazi officials who understood that the war was lost and were funneling money out. So basically, it was a giant money laundering project for certain like high-ranking Nazi officials to bilk Berlin out of cash. And I was like, again, I've never seen any evidence to support it, but I think that's like the most, that to me is the richest one. And then you have like the nuclear weapon one is like a little bit compelling, but again, yeah. And then obviously the time travel one is the most fun. Yeah, but
How close were they?
Right. But there were underground factories. There were underground
factories,
bunkers. It's happening relatively late in the war, right? So it could be a kind of a we're last stand territory.
Relatively late in the war, and we do know that they were incredibly secretive about it, and so to sort of an unusual degree. And so we have reports, from within local Polish villages, that there were sort of concentric circles of soldiers surrounding the site, and that people would just be shot. If they entered sort of that area, they'd just be shot on site. And so the secrecy sort of persisted for a long time after the war, even. Like people just wouldn't talk about them.
And you had some figure or some reference to the amount of concrete that they used.
Yeah. So Albert Speer, in the book he wrote while in prison, so he has those memoirs, I can't remember what they're called, but in an endnote,
I'm the good Nazi, I think.
Yeah, it's like, no, not me. So he mentions...
Not me. That should be the title of every
title.
Nazi memoir ever.
So he has in an endnote there that this, cost about the equivalent to $1 billion US in that time. And again, resources were thin in like 1944 in Nazi Germany, and that it used more concrete than the entire country had at its disposal for air raid shelters. And so the scale is vast. Like they were going to basically hollow out a mountain.
Wow.
So, Malcolm, getting back now, I know Rick is obsessed with Nazi UFOs, but there's other parts of your book that we should talk about.
It's hard not to be obsessed.
Were there other parts of the book?
So, but you have, that you have the narrative of going back to reclaim your property. So, without giving too much away, some of our guests would like to know a little bit more about that, and I'd like to know how you kind of felt sort of bringing your family's narrative into Poland, where there are all these Poles that are living their own lives and have their own history, and how that meshes up.
So it's sort of harkening back to what we said earlier in the program, these like sort of two narratives. I grew up very much ensconced in one of those narratives. And it's like when I started this, that was my narrative. I was saying it's a Jewish property. I'm reclaiming what was once ours, and is still ours. I don't have to care about anything else. But I got pushback, and it sort of really made me reconsider and rethink, and not necessarily question my moral or legal right to the property, but to sort of take into the frame the narratives of the people who live in the building. And so I went in, I met these people, I developed relationships. I found like an incredible rich history to the building itself and to the people who live there. Now, like twist, it turned out to be the wrong building.
You gave it away.
I don't mind. It's a good twist.
But we get to the next building anyway. So.
And you get to the next building, so like there's, it's to me it's a real challenge, and I don't have easy answers to this. But like I'm very grateful that I at least sort of got the awareness to try and grapple with it.
Yeah, I know. I had one of these. It's not the same, but in the weird sort of the same category. I remember my first trip to Poland was right after the wall came down, and I checked into my hotel, and it's late at night, and the guy at the counter is helping me, and I can hear all these people singing down the hall, and I listen, and they're singing German, and then I listen some more, and they're singing all the old songs, those ones. And I go to the Polish guy behind the counter, and I'm like, "What's up with this? And how can you let this happen?" And he just shrugged his shoulders, says, "It's our Germans."
One of the narratives, also like another narrative that I never was familiar with was the forced expulsion of the Germans after the war, and which is the largest forced expulsion in modern history. And so like, I encountering that, and like I have a whole personal story, sort of encountering the family of the woman who saved Abraham Kaiser, and like their forced expulsion, and like that was something I just had never known anything about, and it's just like a lot of people were murdered and forcibly displaced, and it's like that's not a narrative you often hear. So again, I think that there's no solution, but it's to bring these sort of narratives together.
Yeah. There's a lot to untangle there.
Ugh. Endless.
One of the things that struck me, you went, I don't know how many days or hours or days you took to do this, but you visited every site of every camp that your great-grandfather's cousin, Abraham Kaiser, was in this area. And I mean, we're not talking about historical sites as one might think of them today. We're talking about stuff might be in a parking lot or in a bunch of bushes or someplace. I mean, it really is just you had kind of coordinates that people had found, but there's nothing really there. And this is something I think that, I've done, I think Chris has done, where we're trying to find the place where something happened, whether there's anything there or not, just to stand in the spot and say, I'm right there on that spot. And I wondered for you, kind of how you might summarize, did that turn out to be meaningful? I mean, it's obviously something you really set out to do, and how did you feel kind of being in these places, even though in many cases there's no remnant today of what there was at the time?
It's such a good question. Like by nature, I'm not a sentimental person, and so like I don't have like attachment to place because it's a place, and so And yet, I think like if we're dealing with history, we sort of have to adopt a sentimental or even spiritual language to like I sort of recognize that something happened here and therefore this place is important. And it's not that like a plaque is just sort of like it's just sort of like an easy way to access that. But you know, if you have this site where something happened and now that site is turned into a supermarket parking lot, it's well, what do you do? And like, how do you sort of interact to that parking lot? And so like, I had this really complicated. I don't know, and like, I don't. I was really kind of questioning my own motivations. Why even go at all? And here's these places, but it felt something I should do, and I'm like very happy I did it. Yeah, and like I don't. Yeah, at the end of the day, I like sort of grapple with what is my responsibility when I'm there and to these sites, and like how to think about them, how to relate to them, like how are they memorialized, what is the tragedy that they're lost, like I don't know.
So,
Chris, you wanna do a wrap up question?
Okay, well,
are you ready to wrap up? I know
do.
you have one. You always have one.
So I'm going to do the Rick Beyer. I'd like to quote something that you wrote.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, see,
I actually stole that from you.
Oh, okay. Malcolm, you say in the book, it says, it's remarkable how long an act of violence can echo.
Yeah.
So in the process of doing the research for the book and writing the book, are there echoes that you heard that you kind of surprised you? And then the follow-on to that would be, how long do you think people are going to be listening to these echoes? At what point, is this kind of the realm of geeks like, Rick and I?
Yeah, I think the nature of these questions becomes very different depending where you are. And for me, I grew up in Canada. And then I spent most of my time in the U.S. And like these questions about history were so academic. I found them very interesting always, but they didn't feel politically charged. They didn't feel sort of historically charged. They didn't feel like it had anything to do with my space or my like day-to-day life. And that is just not the case in Poland. And or large parts of that world which were like affected by the war in like really sort of granular and like material ways. And so like, yeah, I think, when you walk it, like even my, one tiny personal example of like this building and trying to reclaim it and like, the idea of who's living here and who has the right to live there is like, to me, that, the quote you read from my book, How Long an Act of Violence Can Echo, was in reference to sort of this displacement. And so like, no one from born in 1945 or earlier was still alive in relation to the building, but yet, their grandchildren are, and the sense of ownership, and I'm showing up. And I'm saying there was just such tremendous violence and such tremendous displacement and trauma that these things are still getting like, there's still nothing, it hasn't been resolution. And you see it like in so many different arenas of people trying to figure out like the meaning of all these events and how they affect even modern day society.
Well, Menachem Kaiser, we really appreciate your coming on to talk about a terrific, well-reviewed, really fascinating book, which is called Plunder, Family Property and Nazi Treasure. And the thing is, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that we haven't even touched on, including a very kind of intimate and unusual story of a little tiny corner of the Holocaust. So, kind of worthwhile. Now, do you want to stick around for a moment for the
I'd love to.
massive celebrations that are about to come here?
I'd love that.
Because this is, as it turns out, our 50-second show. It's the 1-year anniversary of History Happy Hour. I don't think we have a band. Did you get a band, Chris, there in London?
Oh, I forgot. I didn't get the memo.
No band, but we have some celebrating that we're trying to do here, and I'm stalling now for the moment because yeah. Well, what's happening on your end, Chris? I mean, what are you bringing to the celebration? Oh,
say.
Nice. Well
don't tell
done.
me I'm not prepared.
Well done. And we've got something here.
Oh,
Thank you.
Wow, now I'm impressed.
Okay, there you go. It's Happy History Hour
Happy
anniversary. Yeah.
Joy. Thank you, Menachem.
Oh, we have champagne.
Wow, I didn't get
Did
champagne.
you bring some for Chris and Menachem?
Yes, I have. The glasses are just down the hall. I'll go get some more glasses for
please
you
do.
guys.
Yes, please do.
They're armed with something. Cheers. Who knew, right?
Mwah.
I'll give a kiss over there as well.
Kiss my cup.
And, yes, we did.
Numero uno. You guys are number one in my book.
We did,
thank
Jane,
you.
bring enough for the whole class. It's just that you have to be here to get it. So, I mean, it's tantalizing and yet tough. But I have a toast that I want to. I mean, first of all, I want to say that in all seriousness, because we joke about this, but this has been great fun, and we've been doing this for a year, and I don't think we'd keep doing it if it wasn't fun. And we've had some great guests. Now, Menachem, I will say that we did have some comments in the chat about you, which is that number one, people said if that's his real living room, love that. And number two was Kathy Hurst said that you had the best sound and visual of anybody that we've had on the show so far.
That is the best compliment I've gotten so far about this while talking about this book.
So there you
New
go.
York Times, forget it. It's the compliment about History Happy Hour.
Because I worked on getting these lights and things, and I bought a microphone.
It's a whole.
Here we go.
Where am I going?
It's a whole thing.
No,
and then the other thing is, I'll turn this. I don't know if you can hear. But
I was going to put.
Marilyn's
okay.
taking a picture, so we have to hold on for the picture. Chris, you got a glass?
No,
here?
I keep hitting Doreen. Wait, no, it keeps moving. I wanted to show Menachem one of these nice comments about that.
Okay, and then the but what I wanted to say was that first of all, we're very grateful to all the people who've come on. Yeah, so that's very nice, Nancy. All the people who've come on the show. It is true. But we're grateful to all the people who've come on the show. We've had some terrific guests. So you've been the most recent, but we had Andrew Roberts, who was amazing, and Chris Wallace, and Lynn Olson, and Don Farrell, and Joe Balkowski, and just some amazing authors. Susan Eisenhower. But we couldn't do it, and it wouldn't happen except for the audience, right? Yeah. And if you guys weren't here, I mean, at its best, this is a conversation that includes all of you, and we all learn about together. And it's been like a year-long graduate seminar in history. And so here's to all of you guys, every one of you who comes here every week, and we so appreciate it. So there it is. Happy History.
Let's hope that season 2 is shorter than season 1.
Well, yeah. So there's no cliffhanger. We'll be here next week. Sorry about that.
Here we go. It's just like in the open.
Right. All right. Just like in the open with the teas. And Menachem, we want to say thank you for being with us here during the very exciting anniversary celebrations. And,
it's such a pleasure. Thank you.
We really appreciate your being our guest today. And again, thank you so much. And hang on, we'll come back to say goodbye to you in a moment. But thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
My
Stay
pleasure.
safe, everyone.
Oh no, we didn't get to the stay safe part, Chris.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're really
I'm
jumping the gun there. Jumping the gun here. So
I'm gonna get back to the party.
I did just want to mention that next week on season 2, episode 1.
Oh,
Season 2, episode
son
1.
of.
We are going to kind of harken back to that time. Do you remember when U.S. troops went into Russia to fight the communists? We all remember that, right?
Right.
100 years ago.
The Whoops invasion.
And it is a book that we have called The Lenin Plot by Barnes Carr, and we're really looking forward to this. This is a wonderful, amazing piece of forgotten history. It's just another one of those things that sort of seems to have gotten swept over the rug, that we had several division of army troops fighting in Russia after World War I. So that's really amazing. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our anniversary special, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week.
Take care. Stay safe.
Nah, that's right.